Throughout the years, it's been rather common to see games come to an end. Some games just end up living through to the end with either the development ending or the servers going offline due to either a lack of players or just the developers running out of ideas. But sometimes a game will just end abruptly before it had a chance to really develop into something big. Now while that does really suck, there's normally a reason to why. We're seeing games like Overkill's The Walking Dead die due to a license being pulled, The Culling 2, well, just being shit. But that's not always the case. There's actually games that don't even get a chance to be released, and all we know about them is either a trailer or a snippet of gameplay, and that's it. And that's really shit. It's always a shame when a game doesn't really meet a deadline or worse gets cancelled early into development, as it can cause a few problems. Expectations are ruined, the majority of the time people are bound to lose their jobs, and for the consumer side of things, we're just kind of sitting there wondering what this game could have been like. It's definitely an interesting topic with a rabbit hole that will go as deep as you want it to be, so today I thought I would talk about 5 games that were cancelled that in my eyes honestly looked interesting. But before we can start, I do have a couple of rules to go over. Firstly, a game can't have already been released and then canned, so games like Overkill's The Walking Dead and Dead Island Epidemic won't get a spot. Secondly, any game that was either stuck in early access or was cancelled during early access won't count either, as that was normally available for anybody to play or purchase into. If a game has a private beta however, that's one thing, but a game that's been released to the public is definitely a no-go. So with that out of the way, let's take a look at 5 cancelled games that could have been really interesting. So here's a fun one to start with, Borderlands. Confused? Well, do you remember that there was a Borderlands MMO that was meant to come out a couple of years ago? Yeah, that was a thing. It didn't really last long as the game was cancelled the year it was supposed to be released, but at one point it was a possibility that a free-to-play Borderlands game was coming out. If you were in China. Yeah, Gearbox randomly announced that Borderlands was coming to China, similar to when Activision randomly released that Call of Duty Online game a couple of years ago. Instead of being a follow-up story to the previous games, it seems that Borderlands Online was just going to be a standalone story, with you having the ability to create your own character, killing the whole aspect of the specific Vault Hunter. Obviously with this being an MMO, you'd have a playstyle to choose from, but that was about it. It looked like it was just going to fall under another generic MMO formula, get quests, go here, kill shit, do raids and repeat. What's interesting though is that from the gameplay we have, it looks like it was developed with the assets from Borderlands 1 rather than Borderlands 2 or the pre-sequel, which I'm not sure for you, that definitely strikes me as odd, as surely they'd want to use the newer assets rather than restricting themselves to the older files. But regardless, the game did gain curiosity not just from people within China, but obviously everywhere else where people was fans of a Borderlands game, as the concept of an MMORPG like Borderlands game isn't an entirely awful idea, and I admit it does sound interesting, but sadly after I think the private beta went around, the game just kinda shut down. Apparently it was due to the game wasn't going to be financially viable for Gearbox to produce, so they just canned it and decided to work on other games. As for Borderlands Online however, well, I wouldn't have been able to play it religiously as servers would have been a nightmare for me in the UK. The actual concept itself of a Borderlands Online game is something I'd like to try out, and it does sound like an idea that would be good. But for now, the idea of Borderlands Online is just something in the past. But honestly I don't really care as much because we're getting Borderlands 3 this year. So here's another weird one for you. Do you happen to remember a game called Brothers in Arms? Now if you're aware of what the Brothers in Arms franchise is, you'd expect this to be some sort of single player, highly intense squad based first person shooter, requiring the player to make quick and crucial decisions on where a squad needs to move to, and with that kind of stuff you could lose squad mates, you could make the game harder for yourself overall, but the concept itself was brilliant and it made itself stand out from games like Call of Duty and Battlefield. So with that idea in mind, keep that in your head while I show you this trailer.
Drink up, boys.
Was?
It's happy hour.
Yeah, that's not Brothers in Arms, is it? No, it's not in the slightest. Okay, so yes, I'm fully aware why this game was cancelled, and yes, the fans of the Brothers in Arms series are entirely correct in hating the announcement of this game, but I only actually found out about this game like last year, and while I definitely agree this shouldn't have been called a Brothers in Arms game, the concept itself actually sounds quite fun. So from what I can gather, Brothers in Arms Furious 4 was meant to be a 4-player co-op shooter, where you'll play one of the 4 protagonists who have been sent to what I assume is Germany during the war to stop the Nazis and just mess up everything. But instead of going for a more historical and realistic approach like the previous games, Furious 4 really didn't take itself seriously in the slightest. I mean, look at the trailer, it doesn't really scream historically accurate, and as for why it sounds interesting, well, I mean, it's a comedic 4-player shooter from the people who made Borderlands. I can't really imagine this being a bad game really, rather it would be an underappreciated game due to the name it took. I'm sure if they just called it Furious 4, or if you wanted the game name to be longer, Furious 4 for the war, then this game might have actually stood a chance. But due to the backlash of the game's announcement, it did eventually meet its end, and was cancelled, which is a shame as I would love to have hoped to try this game out. But if you're curious and you want to see something kind of similar to Furious 4, then Raid World War II is probably going to be the closest game to it. So it's not all a bad thing. As for what happened to the team working on this game, apparently Randy Pitchford claimed once that a lot of the elements that were made for Furious 4 was moved over and implemented into their next game, Battleborn. Yeah, that didn't go well, did it? I think we should probably move on at that point.
What? That was my best pipe, you bounders! No, don't!
Get down!
Good shot, old man.
I don't think much of this weapon.
If you don't know what this game is, I'm very disappointed in you. Timesplitters to me is an underrated series in the FPS genre. Timesplitters 1 is definitely a bit iffy when you look back at it now, but Timesplitters 2 and Future Perfect were amazing games. They had a lot of stupid humour, lovable characters, and overall it was just a game series that I could just keep replaying over and over. But did you know there was actually a 4th installment in the works? Yeah, even I didn't know about this one until 2012 when Crytek came out with the confirmation that this game was no longer being worked on. Apparently no one really knew if it was going to be a financially stable investment, as the previous games weren't as popular as they imagined, which is completely understandable. A massive company like Crytek working on a title like Timesplitters obviously wasn't going to interest many people. As for what Timesplitters 4 involved, well, honestly, I don't even know where to start, as sadly there's not a lot to go by. There's been some concept art floating around the internet, and obviously people have had theories on what the plot could have been, but nothing was really solid enough to determine what Timesplitters actually was. The most likely scenario is that when Free Radical were bought out by Crytek creating Crytek UK, they rebooted the project, but at the same time Free Radical were working on games like Haze, that failure for the PlayStation 3, and then another Star Wars Battlefront game. As for what we know now, currently the original Free Radical is now known as Dambuster Studios, who made games like Homefront Revolution, and obviously various developers over the years have actually gone on to other companies and worked on other things. And I mean, if you look at Homefront Revolution, it's obvious that they're not doing very well. I mean, there was a Timesplitters Easter egg in it which was pretty cool, but that was the only redeeming thing for that game. As for Timesplitters itself though, well, currently THQ Nordic are in their normal tradition of acquiring a lot of licenses, and Timesplitters is one of the recent ones they picked up. So there's obviously hints at a possible Timesplitters remaster or finally another sequel, but personally knowing THQ Nordic at this point, I don't think we're going to hear anything anytime soon. As for why I find this interesting, well, it's Timesplitters. Obviously I want a new game, and while I do hope Timesplitters Rewind is a good fan project, I want an actual continuation into the series, not just a remake of the originals. Perhaps if THQ Nordic noticed the Rewind project, they'll start moving things along faster, but in reality, I wouldn't be surprised if they just sat on the license and never did anything with it. It's a common trope for THQ Nordic currently, and if they do that it will be quite sad. But hey, Timesplitters Rewind might actually come out before they make Timesplitters 4, so that's something. If you don't know what Timesplitters Rewind is though, it's a fan-made project to remake the first 3 games. I don't have a lot of hope in the sense of it coming out anytime soon because it's been taking them for a while, and again, it's a fan project, this is not their job. But if you want to see some gameplay of it, I'll definitely go and have a look at their channel. I'll leave a link in the description, and who knows, maybe eventually we will see Timesplitters Rewind become a massive thing. But until then, it's another game that just isn't going to happen. Do you remember when Star Wars games weren't shit and just cash grabs held hostage by EA? Yeah? And do you remember when Disney weren't idiots and closed down LucasArts Games, and how they've now recently opened it back up because they realised EA are not a good company to give the license to Star Wars to? Well, if you do, then you might remember an upcoming game they cancelled called Star Wars 1313. Now at the time, this game actually looked amazing. I wouldn't call myself the biggest Star Wars fanboy, but I did enjoy a lot of the games. Obviously we had stuff like the LEGO titles, but I'm more talking about games like Knights of the Old Republic, Republic Commando and Jedi Academy. Also the Phantom Menace game for PlayStation 1. But my point is, there's a time where Star Wars games were just as exciting and hyped up as much as the films. And 1313 is a prime example of when developers expanded a universe in the right way. Not holding on to too much of the original license, but enough to tie it into place and make something great. Honestly, I can't praise enough how promising this game looked back when it was announced, and if you haven't seen it, then I highly suggest you give it a look. I remember one of the things a lot of people really loved and picked up about it was how the game went straight from a cutscene into the gameplay without any major graphical loss. Obviously these days this is a more common thing, but back in the day when this was shown, it was fairly rare to see this done so well. So overall, the game nowadays just proves that Disney made the biggest mistake in gaming history, and giving EA the licensing rights was a fucking dumb idea. That and obviously the train wreck known as Battlefront 2, I got that game as a gift and I still feel ripped off. Now, while all the games I've covered so far have been cancelled with no real source that have revival or a reboot, let's take a look at an honourable mention before we look at one last game. Okay, so instead of picking 3 games this time for an honourable mention, I've decided to pick out one game in particular, and that's Dead Island 2. Originally this would have hit the list for being one of the higher spots, as unlike most people, I actually really enjoyed the first Dead Island game, and I still play Dead Island on occasion to this day. But more importantly, apparently Dead Island 2 was never really cancelled, rather it's just in a bit of a development hell situation. So to give it a bit of backstory, the original developers of Dead Island, Techland, split from Deep Silver Publishing. Techland never really owned the license to Dead Island, and while the original games were successful, Deep Silver weren't really keen on the idea of having Techland back to make a third title, so they just announced Dead Island 2 with another developer at the helm, and Techland went on to make another game which was very successful called Dying Light, which might I add is a fantastic game and I'm definitely looking forward to the sequel. So instead Deep Silver went off with a company called Jaeger Development, who previously made Spec Ops The Line, a game that I've heard is really good and I've yet to play it because I don't own it, and after a year we actually saw gameplay and what we interpreted Dead Island 2 to be like, and it honestly looked rather fun. It wasn't ironed out in the slightest, the zombie AI wasn't entirely there, but it did look promising. Graphically it looked better, and honestly I think it could have been a solid sequel, but over time things went a bit sour and Jaeger Development were actually just dropped out of nowhere. And now Deep Silver have partnered up with someone called Sumo Digital, and now apparently 4 months ago Damn Buster Studios have taken over. I honestly have no idea what's going on with Dead Island 2 at this point, but I think at this point the Dead Island 2 we saw years ago is gone. That version of the game is cancelled. We'll never see that version of the game as it was, as that was Jaeger Studios' version of the game, and I can't imagine Sumo or Damn Buster Studios wanted to continue with that development. They'd probably want to reboot the game from scratch, and even till today we haven't seen what Sumo or Damn Buster are even working on, so unless I'm proven wrong, I consider that E3 footage of Dead Island 2 to be a cancelled game. And again, that really sucks because this looked like a brilliant sequel. It's not really cancelled because it's in development hell, so we could just be looking at another Duke Nukem Forever, which in the long run is going to be quite amusing, especially with Dying Light 2 coming out. But we're here to look at cancelled games, so let's just have a look at one more.
6-3. Soon after neighbors called 911, found the father in his car listening to the radio. Several days before the murder, he said, "Look behind you." He said, "Look behind you," like he was chanting some.
Come on. Of course Silent Hills was going to be on this list. This game has been spoken to death more than the game's death itself. And hell, I'm going to be talking about it anyway. Silent Hills was going to be the reboot of one of the most well-known horror game series that spawned from the depths of hell back in the PS1 era. Unfortunately, over time the fear factor and overall polish and enjoyment of these games did start to die down a bit, with the games being mediocre and just being forgotten, with the original title still standing out tall from the test of time. But then Konami had a brilliant idea for once. They let Hideo Kojima, the mastermind behind the Metal Gear Solid franchise, take control of the next game in the series. So out of nowhere during an E3 they released a demo named Playable Teaser, or PT for short, and it was one of the best demos for an unreleased game I have ever seen. I don't normally get scared by horror films or games, but PT scared the shit out of me at points. Instead of being a game focused on jump scares, PT focused on making you feel as uncomfortable as inhumanely possible. Your controller would end up crying whenever someone was nearby, the game would just end up fucking with you, and if you were clever enough to complete the teaser, you'd have learned that this was indeed going to be the next Silent Hill. So why is it a cancelled game? Well, if you remember, Kojima was fired by Konami for various reasons, and with him no longer at the helm, the game was cancelled and they never went further with the project. And yeah, that really sucks. Sucks more than anything else on this list. It was obviously not going to be as good of a game without Kojima's input, but besides that teaser, we knew very little about what Silent Hills was actually going to be about. And to this day we probably never will. But things aren't all that bad. From the demise of Silent Hills we actually got some good things to come out of it. A lot of developers have taken inspiration from this demo and made their own versions of the teaser in stuff like Unreal and Unity. And some developers even went as far to make games based off PT itself, with obvious titles being games like Layer of Fear, and then the very successful title Resident Evil 7. Now we might have gotten these regardless of Silent Hill's cancellation, but there's one thing we wouldn't have got if Kojima wasn't fired. Death Stranding. Yes, being fired by Konami wouldn't stop Hideo Kojima, and he took all the tools he was going to use for Silent Hills, and he's now making his own unique title under his own company. So for what it's worth, we're going to get something brilliant. As for what Death Stranding is though, fuck if I know, but I'm sure there's channels out there that will have various theories about it. So yeah, that's pretty much it. That's 5 games that we're never ever going to be able to play due to cancellation. And there are thousands of more titles out there, but will these 5 titles reappear? I doubt it, not in the form that we've seen so far. So with that disappointment on top of your heads, thank you all so much for watching. I'm curious if there's any games out there which you know that were cancelled which actually sounded interesting, so if so, let me know. But until next time, thank you all so much for watching. My name is Sir Crackerbulb, and I hope you have a cracking week. Goodbye.